Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, is remembered not only as the founder of an empire, but also as a notorious tyrant. Under his rule, war, terror, and forced labor turned the dream of unification into a sea of blood and bones. From the burning of books and burying of scholars to forcing millions into the construction of the Great Wall and his vast tomb, every mark of his power was carved through the horror and suffering of his people. The unification of China under the Qin dynasty emerged from the chaos of the Warring States period, a time when the land was divided among 7 powerful kingdoms. The so-called Six States, Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi, stood in uneasy rivalry against the rising western state of Qin. Each kingdom pursued survival through shifting alliances, fragile treaties, and constant war. Diplomacy was treacherous, with coalitions forming and collapsing almost overnight. The endless cycle of conflict drained populations and hardened rulers, creating a brutal political environment where only the strongest could endure. This was also an age of military revolution. Iron weapons, mass infantry armed with crossbows, and large-scale conscription turned warfare into a clash of entire societies. No longer did aristocratic chariots dominate the battlefield, instead, disciplined formations of soldiers fought for years at a time, supported by immense logistical systems. The construction of walls, fortresses, and defensive lines scarred the landscape, evidence of a world where every state lived in fear of invasion. Against this backdrop, Qin began as an outsider. Situated on the western frontier, it had long been dismissed by the Central Plains kingdoms as uncultured and rough. Yet geography granted Qin both protection and opportunity. Reforms under Duke Xiao and his advisor Shang Yang in the 4th century BCE reshaped Qin society. Legalist principles imposed strict laws, harsh punishments, and collective responsibility. Though severe, these reforms built an efficient bureaucracy and rewarded military merit, transforming Qin into a disciplined war machine. By the time Yingzheng, later known as Qin Shi Huang, took the throne, Qin had surpassed its rivals in both organization and military power. Unlike the other kingdoms, Qin did not fight merely for advantage or survival. Yingzheng pursued a singular goal, the unification of all under heaven. For centuries, philosophers and strategists had spoken of ending the suffering caused by division. Yingzheng seized upon this vision with uncompromising determination. In his mind, there could be no coexistence with rival kings, only their destruction. The legalist ideology reinforced this conviction. Fragmented rule meant weakness, while centralization promised stability and control. Qin's ambition was shaped by both necessity and destiny. Surrounded by hostile powers, the state could not afford complacency. Total victory was the only guarantee of survival. At the same time, Yingzheng's personality, relentless, pragmatic, and ruthless, drove him to see unification not as an option but as his birthright. Qin's ministers crafted a grand strategy: strike first at the weakest enemy, then proceed systematically, breaking coalitions and exploiting divisions. Bribery, intimidation, and diplomacy played their roles, but ultimately, Qin relied on the sword. The Qin conquests unfolded as a relentless sequence of campaigns that crushed the 6 states one by one. Han was the first to fall. Small and weak, it stood between Qin and the Central Plains. In 230 BCE, Qin's armies advanced swiftly. The Han king surrendered without serious resistance. The conquest opened the road eastward. The struggle against Zhao was far harsher. Zhao's cavalry had long been feared, but the kingdom never recovered from the catastrophic Battle of Chongping, 260 BCE. There, Qin general Bai Qi trapped and starved Zhao's army after luring them into reckless battle. When Zhao finally surrendered, more than 400,000 prisoners were executed, most buried alive in mass graves. This massacre shattered Zhao's military strength and instilled terror across all rival states. By 228 BCE, Qin forces seized Zhao's capital, ending its independence. Wei, once powerful, had already declined. After Qin took Han and Zhao, Wei was exposed. In 225 BCE, Qin general Wang Ben used an ingenious tactic: diverting the Yellow River to flood Wei's capital, Daliang. The devastation forced Wei's king to surrender. The greatest resistance came from Chu, the vast southern state. Rich in land and men, Chu fielded huge armies. But in 223 BCE, Qin commanders Wang Jian and Meng Wu launched a decisive offensive, crushing Chu's forces and capturing its king. The campaign was long and bloody, but Chu too was absorbed. In 222 BCE, Qin turned on Yan, which had once tried to assassinate Yingzheng through the failed plot of Jing Ku. Qin's retaliation was merciless, Yan's armies were defeated, and its royal family scattered. The last rival was Qi. Hoping to survive through neutrality, Qi avoided direct conflict, but in 221 BCE Qin armies marched in unopposed. Betrayed by his ministers, the Qi king surrendered without a fight. Thus, within less than a decade, Qin eliminated every rival kingdom. The conquests were not limited wars of expansion. They aimed at complete destruction of enemy states. Armies were annihilated, dynasties erased, and populations forced under Qin's centralized rule. The Chongping massacre remained the defining symbol of Qin's ruthlessness. 400,000 men, captured soldiers who had already laid down their arms, were executed en masse. Ancient chronicles record how pits were dug and filled with suffocated prisoners, their deaths a grim warning to all who defied Qin. For later generations, Chongping epitomized the cruelty of war and the merciless methods by which Qin built its empire. With the fall of Qi in 221 BCE, the Warring States era ended. Yingzheng proclaimed himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, ruler of all under heaven. The dream of unity was realized, but the path to empire had been paved with fire, blood, and terror. Qin's wars of unification were guided by a doctrine of deliberate terror, expressed in the triad: attack the mind, attack the city, attack the people. Victory meant more than defeating armies, it required destroying morale, erasing rival states, and reshaping society under Qin's rule. First was attacking the mind. Qin spread fear long before its soldiers appeared. The massacre at Chongping, where 400,000 Zhao prisoners were buried alive, became infamous across the realm. Diplomats threatened rulers with promises of mercy if they submitted and annihilation if they resisted. Spies sowed distrust in rival courts, pushing kings to replace capable generals with reckless ones. By crushing confidence and instilling dread, Qin often secured advantage before the first battle began. Second was attacking the city. Qin's siegecraft was unmatched in cruelty and efficiency. Its engineers diverted rivers to flood fortresses, built massive siege ramps, and assaulted walls until cities collapsed. The flooding of Wei's capital Daliang in 225 BCE drowned thousands and forced surrender. Unlike other states, Qin rarely spared cities, their destruction served as a warning to all who opposed them. Third was attacking the people. Civilians bore the heaviest burden. Populations of conquered states were slaughtered if they resisted or deported if they submitted. Captives were executed in mass killings, while survivors were conscripted or forced into endless labor building Qin's infrastructure of roads, canals, and fortifications. Families were torn apart, communities uprooted, entire regions left desolate. The social costs were devastating. Villages emptied of men, fields untended, and waves of refugees fled advancing armies. Families disintegrated under the weight of conscription, famine, and loss. Local economies collapsed, leaving hunger and despair across the land. The cultural losses were equally severe. Royal houses were exterminated, aristocratic lineages cut off, libraries looted, and archives destroyed. Cities that had once been centers of learning, ritual, and philosophy were reduced to ruins or absorbed into Qin's centralized system. The diversity of the warring states was flattened beneath the uniform rigidity of legalist order. For survivors, the memory of Qin conquest was written in ruins, toppled walls, burned palaces, mass graves. Fear lingered long after the empire's founding, for the same terror that secured unity also bred deep resentment. Thus Qin's strategy of attacking the mind, the city, and the people succeeded in creating the first empire. But this unity was forged not through persuasion or gradual integration, but through devastation. What was gained in power was paid for with lives, culture, and the erasure of countless communities. The unification achieved by Qin left behind not only a centralized empire but also a legacy of fear. Though Qin Shi Huang accomplished what no ruler before him had, bringing all the warring states under one throne, the methods he used became a lasting memory of brutality. Later chronicles recorded the terror of his conquests. The massacre at Chongping, where 400,000 Zhao captives were buried alive, was remembered as both a triumph and a horror. Historians condemned it as evidence of a regime that prized order over humanity. Confucian writers portrayed Qin as a cautionary tale: legalist methods could build an empire, but only at the cost of moral legitimacy. Among the conquered, memory was even sharper. Families told stories of ruined cities, vanished lineages, and endless conscription. Refugees spoke of neighbors slaughtered and children enslaved. In villages rebuilt atop ashes, survivors whispered of ancestors lost in mass graves. For them, Qin's name became synonymous with terror. Even after unification in 221 BCE, life felt more like war than peace. The empire continued to demand forced labor for colossal projects: the Great Wall, vast canals, and the first emperor's mausoleum. These efforts bound the people to the same machinery of suffering that had destroyed their states. Thus unification came not as liberation but domination. For centuries, thinkers had dreamed of ending chaos by creating all under heaven under one rule. Qin realized that vision, but unity was bought with rivers of blood. The diversity of the warring states was crushed under uniform laws and harsh discipline. While centralization brought efficiency, it also silenced local cultures and sowed deep resentment. That resentment soon erupted. Within years of the first emperor's death, rebellion swept the empire. The dynasty that had conquered all under heaven lasted barely 15 years, undone by the same fear and hatred it had used as weapons. Qin's legacy was paradoxical. It set the model for future empires, standardized laws, measures, and writing, yet became a byword for cruelty. Later dynasties invoked Qin as a warning: power won through terror cannot endure. In the end, Qin proved that China could be unified, but also that unity forged in blood comes with a cost too heavy to bear. The harsh legal system and brutal punishments under Qin Shi Huang. After unifying the 6 warring states and establishing the first centralized empire in Chinese history, Qin Shi Huang chose to rule through terror, placing the entire foundation of his authority upon fear and coercion. In his eyes, the realm had only just been consolidated, loyalties were still divided, and the threat of rebellion lurked everywhere. To secure absolute power, there was but one effective method: the imposition of harsh laws, brutal punishments, and a pervasive climate of fear that extended from the imperial capital to the most remote villages. The origins of this legal system stretched back centuries, when the state of Qin was still a small frontier domain in the rugged western borderlands, constantly harassed by nomadic tribes. This harsh environment shaped a culture of discipline, militarization, and reliance on law. The reforms of Shang Yang in the 4th century BCE laid the foundation for Qin's rigid legalism, rewarding agricultural output and military achievement while punishing all forms of disobedience with severity. These reforms transformed Qin into a disciplined and powerful state with a formidable army. When Qin Shi Huang ascended the imperial throne, he inherited this tradition and expanded it into a comprehensive machinery of terror that enveloped every aspect of society. The guiding ideology was legalism. Unlike Confucianism, which emphasized morality, propriety, and benevolence, legalism rested on the belief that human nature was fundamentally selfish, greedy, and inclined toward evil. If a ruler relied on virtue alone, disorder would prevail. Only strict laws and harsh punishments could bind human behavior and ensure obedience through fear. Thinkers such as Han Fei, Shen Buhai, Shang Yang, and later Li Si, Qin's chancellor, refined this doctrine into a coherent system of fa, law, shi, power, and shu, technique. Qin Shi Huang found this ideology perfectly suited to his aims. Ruling a vast new empire required a binding force, and fear was the most reliable adhesive. The Qin legal code was designed with one overriding characteristic: severity far beyond necessity. Punishments often exceeded the gravity of the offense. A single careless remark about the regime could incur the death penalty. To conceal another's crime was itself a crime punishable as harshly as the original offense. Collective responsibility was enforced ruthlessly. Not only the offender but also his family, sometimes 3 generations, sometimes 9, could be executed. Thus, every individual in Qin society lived with the awareness that a single mistake could bring calamity upon their entire clan. This mechanism transformed fear into a communal restraint, compelling each person to self-censor not only for their own survival but for that of their kin. The punishments themselves were infamous for their cruelty. Execution by cutting the body in half at the waist, slow dismemberment piece by piece, castration, blinding, decapitation with the severed head displayed in the marketplace, and the extermination of entire families were all part of the legal arsenal. Exile to remote, inhospitable frontiers, tantamount to a death sentence, was also common. Mass live burials occurred as well. Artisans who built imperial tombs or sections of the Great Wall were sometimes killed or sealed within the structures to ensure secrecy. These punishments were not merely acts of justice, they were spectacles of violence, staged to display imperial power and to engrave terror into the public consciousness. The impact on everyday life was profound. Ordinary people felt as though they walked perpetually on the edge of a blade. A stray comment in a tavern, a sigh about taxes, a moment's hesitation when conscripted for labor. All could be grounds for arrest and execution. Parents feared their children's loose tongues, siblings distrusted one another, husbands and wives spoke cautiously, friends avoided political discussions. Trust between individuals disintegrated, replaced by constant vigilance and dread. One of the most effective instruments of terror was the policy of rewarding denunciation. The government lavished rewards on informants, while those who concealed crimes faced punishment equal to that of the offenders themselves. As a result, society became a web of mutual surveillance. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members were potential betrayers. Genuine bonds of community and kinship eroded, replaced by suspicion and silence. The entire society fell into a state of enforced muteness. No one dared speak honestly, no one dared preserve old texts, no one dared transmit teachings outside the official legal code. This system of psychological terror transformed Qin China into a colossal prison without walls. Each individual was confined within an invisible cell, surrounded by fear. Public executions amplified this effect. Bloody spectacles staged in marketplaces seared themselves into collective memory. Severed heads, mutilated bodies, and mass burials became symbols of imperial authority and constant reminders of the price of dissent. Compared with previous and later dynasties, the extremity of Qin's system was unmatched. The Zhou dynasty had relied on ritual and kinship. The Han, which succeeded Qin, would combine legalist practices with Confucian morality to achieve balance. Only Qin absolutized legalism, raising fear to the sole foundation of governance. This extremism allowed Qin to impose order swiftly in the short term, but it also stripped the regime of long-term resilience. The people's silence was not born of respect, but of terror. Resentment smoldered beneath the surface, awaiting only a spark. When Qin Shi Huang died, and the machinery of control loosened even slightly, rebellion erupted. The uprising of Chen Sheng and Wu Guang ignited widespread revolt, and the once mighty Qin dynasty collapsed within a mere 15 years of its founding. Yet despite its brevity, the legacy of Qin's harsh laws and brutal punishments endured. The dynasty demonstrated that terror could indeed produce absolute submission, but only temporarily. In the long run, a society governed solely by fear cannot remain stable, for once hope and trust are extinguished, resistance becomes inevitable. Later dynasties learned from Qin's failure. They did not abandon coercion but tempered it with elements of moral governance. Nevertheless, the shadow of Qin's terror haunted Chinese political culture for centuries, standing as both a symbol of ultimate despotism and a warning of the limits of power built on fear. In the end, the harsh legal system and brutal punishments of Qin Shi Huang epitomized the zenith of rule by terror in ancient China. Rooted in legalist philosophy, implemented with ruthless thoroughness, and sustained by spectacles of violence and networks of denunciation, this system transformed society into a vast prison where silence and fear reigned supreme. It secured Qin Shi Huang's grip on power but simultaneously sowed the seeds of his dynasty's downfall. The Qin stands in history as both a testament to the potency of fear and a cautionary tale of its ultimate futility. The burning of the books and the burying of the scholars, Qin Shi Huang's campaign of intellectual terror. In 221 BCE, Qin Shi Huang accomplished what had eluded countless rulers before him, the unification of the warring states into a single empire under centralized authority. Yet conquest was only the beginning. Having subdued rival armies and dismantled rival thrones, he now faced a different challenge: how to control the minds of millions spread across vast territories, speaking in many dialects, and steeped in diverse traditions. Qin Shi Huang was convinced that military power alone would not suffice. To consolidate his reign, he would need to impose absolute ideological conformity, erasing all competing voices from history itself. Thus was born one of the most infamous episodes in world history, the burning of the books and the burying of the scholars. The intellectual landscape of China before Qin unification was rich and vibrant, characterized by what historians later called the 100 schools of thought. Philosophers such as Confucius, Mencius, Laozi, Mozi, and Han Fei had left behind competing visions of order, morality, and government. Some advocated virtue and benevolence, others utility and universal love, still others mystical harmony with the Tao. This pluralism had flourished for centuries, sustained by the autonomy of rival states and their eagerness to attract scholars to court. But Qin had long chosen a different path. Guided by the doctrines of legalism, the Qin rulers built their power on strict laws, harsh punishments, and centralized bureaucracy. Legalist thinkers believed humans were selfish and disorderly by nature, only fear of severe consequences could keep them in line. Shang Yang's reforms had already created a culture of rigid obedience, rewarding agriculture and military service while punishing disobedience without mercy. Qin's rise was inseparable from this legalist ethos, and once the empire was established, Qin Shi Huang had no intention of tolerating intellectual diversity. In 213 BCE, Chancellor Li Si, himself a disciple of legalist thought, presented a memorial that crystallized these anxieties. He warned the emperor that private possession of historical records and classical texts encouraged people to compare the present regime with the virtuous kings of antiquity. Such comparisons, he argued, led to criticism of Qin authority and fostered rebellion. If the empire was to remain stable, Li Si urged, the people must look only to the laws of Qin, not to the memories of the past. Qin Shi Huang agreed, and an imperial edict soon followed. All books outside a narrow range of practical manuals, those on agriculture, medicine, and divination, were to be confiscated and destroyed. Works of history, philosophy, and literature, particularly those associated with Confucian teaching, were condemned. Only officials in the central bureaucracy were permitted to consult such texts, and only for state purposes. For everyone else, possession was forbidden, punishable by imprisonment or death. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. In the capital, Xianyang, piles of manuscripts were carted to great bonfires. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, annals of former states, treatises on morality, records of rituals, verses of poetry, went up in smoke. The flames devouring those scrolls were more than simple censorship. They were an act of deliberate amnesia, a surgical strike against memory itself. By annihilating the records of the past, the Qin regime sought to sever any point of comparison with its present rule. If no one could read of benevolent monarchs or virtuous ministers, then the tyranny of Qin Shi Huang would appear as the only conceivable order. In this sense, the burning of the books was an attempt not merely to silence opposition but to monopolize the very possibility of thought. Yet the destruction of texts was only half the campaign. In the following year, 212 BCE, rumors spread that scholars continued to criticize the emperor's policies in private gatherings. Some mocked his obsession with immortality, others mourned the loss of the classics. To the paranoid eyes of the Qin court, such murmurs were seeds of sedition. The emperor ordered a mass arrest of scholars, many of them Confucians. According to the historian Sima Qian, 460 were executed, most of them buried alive in the capital. Other sources suggest different numbers or alternative methods of execution, but the essence remains: the state moved to exterminate not only the books but the living bearers of knowledge. The symbolism was chilling. The fires consumed the words of the past, the soil swallowed the men who remembered them. Together, these acts announced that Qin would tolerate no rival traditions, no voices of conscience, no alternative visions of government. The empire would have one truth, and that truth was the will of the emperor. For those who witnessed the flames and the burials, the message was unmistakable: to preserve ancient learning was to invite death, and to criticize Qin rule was to be annihilated utterly. The immediate impact was one of suffocating silence. Intellectual life, once so animated, was strangled. Surviving scholars either retreated into hiding or ceased to speak altogether. Ordinary people, terrified by the sight of book burnings and mass executions, withdrew into obedience. Conversations grew cautious, households censored themselves for fear of betrayal. The public sphere, once alive with debate, shrank into a barren desert of conformity. Qin appeared to have achieved its aim: no alternative narratives, no moral philosophers to question legalism, no historical records to challenge its authority. For a brief moment, the empire was united not only under one throne but under one voice, a voice enforced by terror. But the cultural losses were catastrophic. Vast libraries built over centuries disappeared. Works of history chronicling the rise and fall of ancient kingdoms, philosophical treatises that represented the distilled wisdom of generations, poetic masterpieces that captured the spirit of the age, all perished in the flames. Later dynasties would attempt to reconstruct the Confucian classics from memory, oral transmission, or fragments hidden from Qin's reach, but many texts were lost forever. What survived did so precariously, often through the dedication of families who risked their lives to conceal manuscripts in walls or underground. The result was a civilization diminished, a golden age of intellectual diversity reduced to ashes by the will of one man. Politically, the campaign deepened the gulf between the Qin state and the scholar gentry class. The humiliation and massacre of Confucian intellectuals created wounds that never healed. When Qin collapsed shortly after Qin Shi Huang's death, many scholars eagerly lent their support to the Han founders. The Han dynasty, while retaining elements of legalist administration, deliberately elevated Confucianism to state orthodoxy. This was both an act of reconciliation and a symbolic rejection of Qin's brutality. Where Qin had tried to obliterate Confucius, the Han enshrined him, ensuring that his teachings would dominate Chinese political culture for the next 2 millennia. The legacy of the book burnings and executions extended beyond politics. They became a moral parable, remembered as a warning of the dangers of unchecked despotism. Later dynasties continued to censor and suppress, but none dared to repeat the scale of Qin's annihilation. The phrase, burning of the books and burying of the scholars, became synonymous with tyranny itself. Ironically, Qin's persecution of Confucianism helped secure its eventual triumph. By turning scholars into martyrs, the dynasty ensured that later generations would regard them with reverence, their ideas with renewed strength. And yet the episode reveals a deeper paradox of history. A regime may seek to erase memory, to monopolize truth, to terrify its people into silence. For a time, it may succeed. But memory has a way of surviving, of resurfacing through hidden fragments, whispered stories, and the resilience of human thought. Qin Shi Huang's flames silenced a generation, but they could not extinguish the enduring power of ideas. His dynasty, despite its might, crumbled within 15 years of its founding. The teachings he tried to suppress outlasted him by millennia. The burning of the books and the burying of the scholar stands today as one of the most devastating assaults on cultural heritage in human history. It demonstrates the fragility of knowledge when confronted with political power, but also the futility of attempting to eradicate thought through violence. Qin Shi Huang sought to secure his rule by destroying the past, yet in doing so he ensured that his name would forever be associated not with eternal glory but with despotism and fear. His actions serve as a cautionary reminder that while fear can silence voices, it can never destroy the human drive to remember, to question, and to resist. Monuments built on bones, forced labor under Qin Shi Huang. After unifying the realm, Qin Shi Huang pursued an ambition not only to rule but to leave behind structures so immense that they would proclaim his glory for eternity. He believed that the permanence of his dynasty had to be inscribed upon the landscape in stone, brick, and earth, grand projects that would serve both practical defense and symbolic demonstration of imperial authority. Thus he ordered the construction of colossal works such as the Great Wall, the Apang Palace, the Mausoleum at Mount Li, and an extensive network of roads, canals, and storehouses. Yet behind the magnificence of these undertakings lay a brutal truth: they were erected not with the wealth of the state alone but with the blood and bones of countless forced laborers. The Great Wall stands as the most famous of these projects. Long before Qin, the northern states had built fragmented fortifications to ward off the nomadic Xiongnu. Qin Shi Huang commanded that these scattered walls be joined and extended into a continuous barrier stretching thousands of li across mountains, valleys, and deserts. To accomplish this feat, the court mobilized millions of soldiers, convicts, and peasants. With no machinery, every stone was carried on backs and shoulders, every mound of earth lifted by hand. In summer, men collapsed beneath scorching suns; in winter, they froze under blizzards that whipped against their bare skin. Food was scarce, clothing insufficient, and the work relentless. Exhaustion claimed thousands, famine and disease claimed more. The bodies of the dead were often buried directly beneath the foundations, their bones mingled with the earth they had piled. Folk memory long remembered the wall as the longest graveyard in the world, each brick sealed with human suffering. While the wall consumed lives on the frontiers, the capital of Xianyang witnessed the rise of the Apang Palace, intended to be the grandest imperial residence ever conceived. It was designed to dazzle with its scale: endless halls, vast roofs adorned with jade tiles, corridors flowing like waves of the sea. But its splendor was built on misery. Hundreds of thousands of laborers were conscripted to fell timber, quarry stone, and fire bricks. The palace was not a necessity for the people, it was a monument to imperial vanity, a tangible proclamation that the Son of Heaven commanded not only the land and its armies but the very labor and lifeblood of his subjects. Historical accounts tell of columns of peasants driven toward the capital, their cries echoing along the roads as families were torn apart. Women mourned husbands and sons taken away, knowing they might never return. Perhaps the most haunting project was the mausoleum at Mount Li, today renowned for its army of terracotta warriors. Construction began as soon as Qin Shi Huang ascended the throne, employing more than 700,000 workers over decades. Inside the mountain, chambers were carved to form an underground palace, complete with artificial rivers and lakes filled with flowing mercury, ceilings studded with pearls to imitate stars, and entire armies of life-sized clay soldiers to guard the emperor in death. But for each statue admired today, there were countless anonymous laborers who died in darkness, crushed by collapsing tunnels or poisoned by fumes. Rumors persisted that when construction was complete, many artisans and craftsmen were executed or sealed alive within the tomb to preserve its secrets. Thus the mausoleum was not merely the resting place of a single emperor, it was the collective grave of tens of thousands. Beyond these monumental works, Qin Shi Huang also ordered the construction of an immense infrastructure network. Straight roads radiated from the capital, carving through mountains and plains alike, forming the first imperial highway system of China. Canals such as the Lingxiu linked major rivers, enabling the movement of troops and supplies across regions. These achievements transformed the empire's geography, facilitating control and economic integration. Yet the cost was staggering. Villages were emptied of able-bodied men, households lost their breadwinners, and those conscripted rarely returned. The expression that spread among the people, "the road of no return," captured the despair of forced laborers who knew conscription meant almost certain death. In all these projects, one feature was constant: compulsory labor enforced by terror. No peasant could refuse. Every household had to provide workers. To resist was to risk execution. The law extended even to collective punishment. Entire families could suffer if one member attempted to flee conscription. The result was devastation in the countryside: farms abandoned, fields lying fallow, children orphaned, women widowed, communities reduced to ruins. Families watched helplessly as their strongest men were marched away to toil for imperial glory, never to be seen again. To Qin Shi Huang, these grand works symbolized his supreme power. The Great Wall was proof that the empire could bend mountains to its will and hold back barbarian invasions. The Apang Palace embodied imperial magnificence, a monument to his self-image as ruler of eternity. The mausoleum at Mount Li was his vision of immortality, a kingdom underground where he would reign forever. To the people, however, these same structures were not symbols of glory but of suffering. Each wall stone recalled the groans of a dying man, each pillar of the palace echoed with the wails of broken families, each clay soldier of the tomb stood upon countless human sacrifices. The political consequences were profound. Forced labor bred resentment across every province. People cursed the dynasty in whispers, unable to speak openly for fear of the law. Hatred festered in silence, waiting for the first crack in imperial control. When Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE and the machinery of terror briefly faltered, uprisings erupted almost immediately. The peasant rebellion of Chen Sheng and Wu Guang in 209 BCE, sparked by conscription pressures, lit the fuse of revolt that would consume the dynasty. The very labor system meant to glorify Qin had instead sown the seeds of its downfall. Looking back, the colossal works of Qin still stand as marvels of human achievement. The Great Wall is counted among the wonders of the world. The terracotta warriors are admired as a cultural treasure of global significance. The remains of imperial roads and canals testify to early feats of engineering. Yet alongside admiration runs a darker memory: these wonders were built not in prosperity but in blood. They were monuments raised upon bones, symbols of a dynasty's grandeur and its cruelty alike. The paradox of Qin's labor policy is stark: its ambition reached beyond its time, but its brutality ensured its own destruction. The dynasty shone brilliantly for a moment in history, only to vanish after 15 short years, leaving behind legacies as much of horror as of wonder. Obsession with immortality, Qin Shi Huang's doomed quest for eternal life. From the moment he unified China in 221 BCE, Qin Shi Huang carried a burden that seemed to grow heavier with every passing year: the knowledge of mortality. He had achieved what no ruler before him had managed. He was the first emperor of a land once fractured by centuries of warfare, a man who bent 6 rival states beneath his armies and forged them into a single empire. He standardized weights and measures, currencies and scripts, laws and roads. He raised walls against the barbarians, palaces for his court, and a mausoleum for himself. Yet none of this grandeur could shield him from the simplest, most universal of truths: all men die. To Qin Shi Huang, death was not merely a personal end. It was a threat to the permanence of his empire. How could the glory of unification, the authority of the first emperor, survive if the man who embodied them vanished into dust? For a ruler who demanded absolute obedience, the idea that his power was bound by the limits of human lifespan was intolerable. And so, from early in his reign, he developed an obsession that would dominate his later years: the pursuit of immortality. This obsession was not born in a vacuum. The Chinese intellectual world of the 3rd century BCE was steeped in traditions that spoke of immortals, of sages who transcended death, of islands across the seas where divine beings lived forever. Taoist thought, in particular, emphasized harmony with the cosmos and hinted that those who mastered its mysteries might achieve longevity or even immortality. Alchemists experimented with minerals and herbs, concocting elixirs they claimed could prolong life. Legends spoke of distant paradises, such as Penglai, where immortals dwelt and where miraculous plants and substances could be found. For a ruler anxious about his mortality, these traditions offered not just hope but an imperative. If eternal life was possible, could the Son of Heaven do less than pursue it? Qin Shi Huang's quest soon took material form. He summoned alchemists and magicians to his court, demanding they provide him with formulas for longevity. He patronized men who promised him cures, potions, and pills. These court magicians enjoyed influence so long as their promises sustained the emperor's hopes. But his patience was thin, and failure was dangerous. Many who failed to deliver results were executed, sometimes along with their families, in accordance with Qin's harsh laws of collective punishment. Yet others continued to appear, for the rewards of imperial favor were immense, and some were confident in their ability to deceive or at least delay judgment with vague promises of success. Among the most famous figures in this saga was Su Fu, a court sorcerer who persuaded the emperor that the elixir of immortality could be found on islands across the eastern seas. Su Fu claimed that beyond the horizon lay the fabled Penglai, home to immortals and miraculous herbs. In 219 BCE, Qin Shi Huang sent Su Fu with a fleet of ships, thousands of young men and women, and craftsmen to seek this elixir. The fleet sailed east but returned with nothing but excuses. Storms, sea monsters, and hostile forces had prevented success. The emperor, furious, might well have executed Su Fu, but the sorcerer cleverly convinced him that the expedition had only failed for lack of sufficient resources. A second voyage was organized, even larger than the first. This time, Su Fu never returned. Some legends hold that he settled in Japan, bringing with him knowledge of Chinese agriculture and crafts. For Qin Shi Huang, however, the result was betrayal, yet another promise of immortality unfulfilled. The emperor's frustration grew. Each failure deepened his paranoia. He began to suspect not only the incompetence of his servants but their treachery. He came to believe that many around him plotted to conceal from him the true secrets of immortality or to deprive him of them for their own gain. His punishments became increasingly severe. Envoys who returned empty-handed were executed, their families annihilated. Alchemists who failed to produce convincing results were tortured, accused of deceiving the Son of Heaven. The climate of fear intensified as court officials realized that even association with failed quests could mean death. Yet Qin Shi Huang did not abandon his search. He consumed pills and potions made of strange substances, powdered jade, rare herbs, cinnabar. Ironically, many of these concoctions contained mercury and other toxins. Instead of prolonging life, they likely weakened his health, contributing to the ailments that plagued him in his later years. Still, he clung to the hope that immortality could be grasped. The thought of dying, of losing all he had built, remained unbearable. His obsession with eternal life shaped not only his personal habits but also the governance of the empire. He grew increasingly secretive and distrustful. Reports suggest that he avoided sleeping in the same palace chamber 2 nights in a row, fearing assassination or spiritual attack. He relied heavily on a small circle of trusted attendants, yet he doubted even them. His suspicion extended to his sons, his ministers, and his generals. The more he sought immortality, the more isolated he became, convinced that others sought his downfall or that they withheld the knowledge he craved. In 210 BCE, during a grand inspection tour of the empire, Qin Shi Huang fell gravely ill. He was far from the capital, in the sands of eastern China, when death overtook him. Ironically, he died not in a palace surrounded by courtiers but on the road, consumed by the very paranoia his obsession had cultivated. The man who dreamed of eternal life, who demanded that his empire be eternal, passed away in a lonely entourage, shrouded by mistrust. His attendants concealed his death for weeks, transporting his body back to the capital in secrecy, fearing unrest. The first emperor, who had sought to conquer death itself, could not escape its grasp. The irony of his end did not escape later generations. Qin Shi Huang's legacy as the unifier of China is undeniable, yet his obsession with immortality became a cautionary tale. The fleets he dispatched drained resources. The executions of failed envoys and alchemists created resentment. The potions he consumed may have hastened his demise. And the climate of fear and mistrust undermined the cohesion of the state. His dynasty, like his life, proved fleeting. Within 4 years of his death, rebellion toppled Qin rule. Yet the story of his obsession endured in cultural memory. Later historians and poets painted him as both awe-inspiring and tragic. A man who conquered nations but not his own mortality, who built wonders that endured for millennia but could not preserve himself. His mausoleum at Mountley, guarded by thousands of terracotta warriors, stands as the ultimate irony. While he sought eternal life in this world, what he achieved was an eternal tomb, a monument to his fear of death and his failure to transcend it. Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality reveals the paradox at the heart of power. The greater the achievements, the more unbearable the thought of losing them. The more absolute the authority, the more terrifying the prospect of death's leveling hand. For the first emperor, immortality was not just a dream but an obsession that shaped his reign and hastened its collapse. In the end, the pursuit of eternal life delivered only isolation, paranoia, and an ignominious death on the road. His story remains a timeless reminder that the fear of death, when magnified by absolute power, can become a force as destructive as death itself.